Your Holiness, thank you so much for accepting this interview.
Thank you for having me.
Your Holiness, as a Catholicos Patriarch of the Assyrian Church of East, how do you personally view your mission in today's Christian landscape?
Well, the mission of the Catholicos Patriarch of the office, I would say, particularly today, is twofold. One, in terms of the internal life of the Church, the Assyrian Church, which is now already, these past many decades, a global church. And in fact, the majority of our faithful are in the diaspora outside of the Middle East, of course. So that creates many different more challenges and opportunities, I think, for the Church and her leadership. But internally, of course, as the primate, as the head of the Church and the head of the Holy Synod, there is always the ministry of confirming the faithful in their faith. There is always the aspect of continuing that 2 millennia long ministry of the Patriarchate, which we trace back to the Apostle St. Thomas, who founded the Church of the East in the first decades of the Christian era. And then externally, there is also today an added mission of the Patriarchate in terms of relations with other Christian churches, other apostolic historical churches, particularly in the Middle East, where the majority of these churches find their origins. Mm-hmm. And so today our milieu is a global village. We are not isolated as we might have been maybe a century ago. Mm-hmm. So that creates the opportunity for more ecumenical relations, for reaching out, for putting out the tradition that is unique to the Church of the East, to the Assyrian Church of the East. So there's both an internal and an external aspect to the patriarchal ministry, I would say.
Your Holiness, before diving into the depth of this conversation, I would like to ask you about your personal testimony moving from USA to Iraq. You lived your entire life in USA and you served the church there. And then after your election as a head of the Assyrian Church of the East, you moved to Iraq. How do you see this move from USA to Iraq?
Well, naturally, any move of this type will have its challenges in the beginning, and I've had my fair share of challenges. I can safely say that I am adapted and acclimated now to my new environment, for which I'm thankful. But ever since I entered upon my priestly ministry, I was always changing locations after a few number of years, whether it was during my period of studies, where I studied abroad, or when I came back to serve the church in the US. And even in the US, I was transferred to at least 2-3 different parishes in different cities, different ends of different parts of the country. So I've always found myself on the move for the most part. And I think that sort of mentally prepared me never to be fully attached to one particular place.
Another important
But
move...
I'm here permanently now, so I hope there's no more moving after this.
Your Holiness, another important move for the headquarters or the Holy See of the Assyrian Church of East was moving the headquarters from USA to Iraq. Was that a strategic move for the church?
Indeed, and it was also, I believe, a historical move. The Patriarchate was exiled from Iraq in 1933, as you know, when the country was just being formed, and unfortunately there were certain political situations within the country where, for lack of a better description, there was no space for the Assyrians as an ancient people, as an indigenous people, I would say, of the country. Be that as it may, the Patriarch was exiled in 1933 and eventually settled in the United States in 1940. So until 2015, at the time when my predecessor, Margaritis III, was elected, the Patriarch had always been in the United States. And so in 2015, it was moved to Iraq, to Erbil predominantly, of course, in the Kurdistan region of the country. And as the successor of that Patriarch who made the move of the Patriarchal See, the see is permanently in Erbil. And the reason for that is because the majority of our people are in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. So, and throughout history, we have had periods where the Patriarchate was in Arbil. For example, during the Mongolian period in the Middle Ages, for a little under a century, the Patriarchate was in Arbil and its surroundings. So history repeated itself after 700 years almost.
Your Holiness, do you think that this move might preserve what's left from Christians and help the Assyrians particularly to stay in the country and not going to diaspora?
Right. Well, indeed, that was one of the strategic reasons for the move of the Patriarchate, is because at that time, of course, in 2015, that was 1 year already into the tragic and catastrophic events of ISIS, of Daesh in Iraq, particularly in the region. And so that slow bleeding of migration of the Christians as a whole began during that period. And we're still living through that, maybe on a less alarming rate, but nonetheless, it's still there. So I think that was the thinking of the Holy Synod of the Church as a whole, was to give a strong message for the Assyrians and the other Christians, brothers and sisters living in the country and in the region, and to help support our people, basically, to help them to stay. And that's very important, especially having a patriarch who was born and raised in the West, being elected to the highest office of the Church, and coming to live in Iraq, in Arbil, is indeed, I think, a strong message for the faithful and for our relationship with other Christian churches.
Now, we'll take this opportunity now to talk more about this aspect of the interview, Your Holiness. How do you describe the current relationship with other churches, particularly the Catholic Church?
Well, on a global level, of course, we have very good relations with the Catholic Church, and that relationship began in 1984 when my pre-predecessor met the late Pope John Paul II at the Vatican. He was also present for his inauguration in Rome in 1978, but they met on a more official level in 1984, and they decided to begin a theological dialogue in order to clear the misgivings and unhappy situations of the Church at the time of the early councils of the Church. And so a mixed theological dialogue committee was established, and in 1994 there was the Common Christological Declaration that was signed by the heads of our two churches. And in 2017 we also signed a document with the Roman Catholic Church on the shared understanding of the sacraments of the Church. So that relationship has been a very strong one. Of course, the Assyrian Church has other dialogues too. We have an official bilateral dialogue with the Russian Orthodox Church, which was established in 2015. And we have very good relations with other local churches here in the Middle East, in Iraq, and abroad as well.
So in the light of the Christological agreement of 1994, there has been some other dialogues that have been made since then. How do you assess the progress since then?
Well, indeed, the 1994 declaration was monumental, not just in the relations between the Assyrian Church and the Catholic Church, but I think in the area of theology as well, because one of the greatest of the Christological controversies of the early synods, the councils of the Church, the ecumenical councils, particularly which occurred at the Council of Ephesus in 431, from a very important aspect was resolved, in that the Christology of the Assyrian Church was seen to be orthodox, was understood by the West, particularly by the Catholic Church, and it was recognized as being an orthodox Christology. And so after that point, many opportunities were open to the Assyrian Church in terms of dialogue, in terms of sharing ecumenical theological students, relations, for example, with the Middle East Council of Churches, which the Assyrian Church for a period of 1 year in 1995 was a member, and then later, unfortunately, was asked to leave due to the veto by one of the largest bodies in the Middle East Council of Churches. And so ever since then, really, the relationship, particularly with the Catholic Church, has been very, very promising. We're now in the third stage of dialogue, and we have a joint international mixed theological committee made up of theologians from the Catholic Church and the Assyrian Church, and they meet on an annual basis. And this year they're supposed to meet here in Erbil at the invitation of our Patriarchate, so we might be hosting them most likely. And the progress has been continued, and it's been steady. Obviously, in our third phase now, we are discussing the constitution of the church. And so there are various topics that are included in that. The hot topic, of course, is the primacy of the church, primacy on a local level, on a universal level, and the issue of papal primacy and the role of the Bishop of Rome on the universal level of communion is also of great importance. We haven't arrived at that stage yet, but that's coming along. I served on that committee from 2007 to 2021, basically, to my election as Patriarch. And I must say that there is a great spirit of fraternity that is always exercised during the meetings. There is a lot of serious scholarship that takes place. Unfortunately, these presentations and papers are not published yet. They are kept within the scope of their working papers for the joint committee. In the future, they probably will be published, but theologically, they're very sound. And they're delving into deep issues that oftentimes, especially today, they're taken for granted, or people will just, oftentimes church leaders will just repeat things they've heard in the past, but they have not actually sat down and studied them theologically, scientifically, philosophically. And when you do that, then you will see that there are ways of understanding, not of changing doctrine, but of understanding it in a new light that will bring understanding and bring ultimately reconciliation.
Your Holiness, we may understand that there's a continuous dialogue between the two churches, but many wonder, what are the main theological differences between the two churches?
Right. Well, up until 1994, as I mentioned, the main issue was Christology. And the reason for that is the issue that's seen as being the breaking point of communion in terms of the Church of the East, the Assyrian Church, and the other churches in the West historically. So Ephesus, Chalcedon, and things of that nature. We're beyond that now in terms of the dialogue. We have also come to an understanding on the nature of the sacraments. Although that does not mean that we have full communicatio sacris, there is a very limited intercommunity that's allowed in cases of pastoral necessity for sharing the Eucharist between the two churches. But the main issues now will be seen, as I mentioned, in the third phase of dialogue, which is on the constitution of the church. And so the theologians and scholars that have been working on the dialogue, I was fortunate to be a part of the beginning of that phase, was going back to very elementary concepts of what it means to be church, stemming from the Old Testament and the New Testament and the writings of the fathers of the Western Church and of the Church of the East. So the committee didn't delve directly into the issue of papal primacy, for example, or various levels of communion. They began by studying what does it mean to be church. And then another important topic was what are the images of the church, especially in the New Testament. There's various images. How are those images to be understood scripturally, biblically, and also patristically, and how the church now receives all of that. So a lot of work has gone into the dialogue. And so I know all of the members personally, and we have some very big minds theologically that are working on these issues. And of course, arriving at unity in the church, arriving at communion in the church, and the reconciliation of the churches is predominantly a gift of the Holy Spirit. It is something for which we have to pray, and we have to pray with an open mind and, more importantly, an open heart, so that the Holy Spirit will be able to inspire us to move in the direction that He desires for us.
Amen. Your Holiness, you met the late Pope Francis in more than one occasion. Can you tell us a little bit about your meetings with him? What were the dialogues? What you were talking about when you were meeting?
Well, I've had I would say the very happy occasion of meeting the late Pope Francis, as you mentioned, on quite a number of occasions. I was with my pre-predecessor, Patriarch Bernard IV, in 2014 when he met him officially for the first time, and I was translating between the two. I've met him with my predecessor, Marguerite III, on 2 occasions in his official visits, and I have had the occasion as Patriarch to visit him twice officially. And I have always seen him to be a very opening and welcoming and a very loving, not only pastor or pope, but also Christian. So he really was a deep Christian deep down, a very faithful Christian, I think. And he always expressed his openness in terms of ecumenical relations and dialogue. And he was very accommodating and very willing to go the extra mile in order for churches to be closer to one another.
How do you describe him as a pope and pastor who was promoting the unity between the church? And most importantly, what were the messages that he tried to convey to you and to the Assyrian church?
Obviously, he had a very keen and deep pastoral sense, and that stemmed from his own background, going back to when he was a priest and a bishop and later a cardinal in Argentina, and his own work in the church. He had ecumenical relations there with various Orthodox and other Eastern churches that existed in the country. And I think he brought that experience with him to Rome when he became Pope. His openness and willingness to find new ways in order to bring the churches closer together, I think, was a hallmark of his ecumenical, the ecumenical aspect of his ministry as Bishop of Rome. So, for example, one issue that he always spoke about, and we've had personal conversations about this, was the deep desire he had to find a common date for the celebration of Easter, to which all of the churches could agree. And he had mentioned that quite often, and he really did labor for it among the heads of churches. Unfortunately, he hasn't seen that realized during the time of his papacy. But that was something I believe that was very dear to his heart. And of course, even the Assyrian church at various levels was keen on accepting the common date for Easter, as are some of the other Eastern churches as well. The other thing was, and again, we've had conversations about this when we had met in Rome, was his desire to not redefine, I would say, but to put the understanding of the ministry of the Bishop of Rome in a new light in today's context, whereby the other non-Catholic churches could appreciate it and could understand it. And I remember during I believe it was the first visit I had with him in 2022, he mentioned that he is concentrating on the title Bishop of Rome.
More than a pope.
More than Pope of the Roman Catholic Church, or the other titles that are listed in the Annuario Pontificio that has the official titles of the Pope. For example, he reinstated the title of Patriarchal Basilicas for the 4 main churches in Rome, because he wanted to demonstrate that he was the Bishop of Rome and Patriarch of the West, which is something that is also
More
to
acceptable.
be found in our own canon law tradition and the tradition of the other churches. So he did take those concrete steps in order to demonstrate his closeness and his willingness and his desire to bring the churches closer to arrive at a point that we could all agree on, based on our common tradition.
Your Holiness, there's a new Pope now, Pope Leo XIV. Do you see and hope that he will continue the legacy of Pope Francis? How do you look at this new era in the Catholic Church? And what are your hopes, basically?
Well, obviously, every new pope, every new patriarch always brings a new era for their church. And that is, I think, a blessed opportunity from God, because then you have, it's sort of like pressing the restart button, if you will. Not on major issues of doctrine, of course, but on ways of doing church or ways of being church, taking into account a lot of modern contexts that didn't exist 500 or 1,000 years ago. So Pope Leo, who actually I will be attending his inauguration as the Bishop of Rome, brings that new experience with him. Obviously, he's made history by being the first American-born Pope. And one thing we share in common is that we were both born in Chicago, so he's a fellow Chicagoan on that level. And I think his experience as an Augustinian, as his priestly experience, his episcopal ministry in Peru, bring quite a bit of gifts along with him that he could use for the good of the church. And so I'm sure that our Roman Catholic brethren are very looking forward very much to his leadership in the Catholic Church. I and many other Eastern non-Catholic primates are looking very much forward to his stance on ecumenical relations, which I'm sure we will be discussing with him in the future, and other issues, of course, that concern all of Christianity. Because in many issues, in many contexts, many respects, we are really in the same boat, particularly when we look at the state of Christianity in the Middle East. That is something that we are all concerned about. And really it goes beyond the ecclesiastical borders, if you will, of each church. And that's a common concern for all of us. But I believe that in the ecumenical field, he will make quite a bit of new progress, maybe things that we haven't thought of. And so we're hopeful and we have an open mind, and we wish him all of the best and the guidance of the Lord and the grace of the Holy Spirit for his new ministry.
Your Holiness, your church, the Assyrian Church of East, is working on hosting a significant event that will be in September to mark the 1700 years anniversary of Council of Nicaea. Why the Assyrian Church is taking this initiative, and why it's important, in your opinion?
Why not?
Why not?
Well, actually, this discussion came about in our last Holy Synod in 2024, especially when the conversation was brought up in many ecumenical contexts, whether it was in Rome or whether it was various other patriarchs, the ecumenical patriarch, for example, of Constantinople, other patriarchs. So there was quite a bit of talk about the 1700th anniversary of Nicaea. And so we discussed in our synod that why not have the Assyrian Church also play a role in celebrating Nicaea. So the importance of Nicaea, of course, again, transcends ecclesiastical borders. Nicaea is part of the common tradition of all of the churches. It's the first ecumenical council. It's the first ecumenical council accepted without distinction by all of the churches. We all adhere to the Council of Nicaea's creed. So it was important, I thought, and along with the bishops, that we also have a celebration of type. Now, we thought of having an academic conference, which we have around 30 or so confirmed scholars from different ecclesiastical traditions. Some of them are, of course, scholars just on the basis of academia. They're coming in. Others are church-related. From the Dicastery for Promoting Christian Unity, we have a presence, or will be having a presence, and from various other Orthodox churches as well. So I'm very happy that we're able to convene this international conference. And the focus, and this is, I think, in answering your question directly, will be on the relationship between the Assyrian Church and the Council of Nicaea, and what does Nicaea mean for the Assyrian Church? As you know, where the Church of the East is the only church that was not present somehow at the Council of Nicaea. And we had received the council only in the year 410, along with the creed and with the canons of the council. So that experience of reception of the council, some almost 70, 80 years after the fact, is very interesting, and it's very deep for understanding historical theology. And so we want to give the Church of the East's understanding and perspective on the Council of Nicaea, and that's what the scholars will be concentrating on predominantly.
Your Holiness, do you think that this conference and this event will play a role in Christian unity somehow, even if it's locally, by inviting maybe other churches to the dialogue in this conference?
Definitely, yes. We will have all of the local churches will be invited here present in the Kurdistan region, in Iraq as a whole, internationally as well. So we do hope that this conference will play its part in a better understanding of Nicaea and the universality of the Council of Nicaea. And importantly, so the emphasis has always been on what does Nicaea mean for the West, because obviously it was an ecumenical council of the Western Church, of the Roman Empire. Having this perspective from the Persian Church, or the church that existed in the Persian Empire, outside of when and where the council took place, is very unique. And I think it adds an aspect that only the Church of the East could add to the council. I think it will help to broaden the depth of the understanding of the council, because then how can a church that has not participated in the council receive, and the reception, of course, is a theological phenomenon in and of itself. How can such a church receive this council, its symbol of faith, and the canons, and make it its own in a totally different linguistic and cultural context? And that's very, very huge. So it's shifting from the Greco-Roman context of the council to Eastern Syriac within the Persian Church, the Persian Empire, a church that was not, at least demonstrably, in communion with the Roman Mass for obvious reasons, because there was the continued fighting between the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire, so you couldn't have visible communion in that sense. But there was a theological, spiritual communion to a great extent.
Great.
So I think it adds a very, very important aspect to a much fuller understanding of Nicaea. And what better time to do that than on the 1700th anniversary?
Your Holiness, what would be, at the end of this dialogue, what would be your message for the faithful of the Assyrian Church of the East, but also other believers of other churches, especially in Iraq, but also globally?
Of course, well, predominantly, first and foremost, to the Assyrian faithful, I would say it is very important to remain faithful to our ecclesiastical tradition, our theology, our faith, our history, our identity, particularly in the diaspora. I mentioned earlier that the majority of our faithful are in the diaspora countries today. And so that poses challenges of its own, one of which is preserving the identity. And this is something that all of the ethnic Eastern churches are facing in one fashion or another. Of course, we are not immune to that, so we also have that challenge before us. And so I would like to put that challenge before all of our faithful, particularly the youth, to be faithful to their tradition of the Assyrian Church of the East, wherever they're living in the world. To the broader context, of course, to our Christian brothers and sisters, especially those living in the West, of different traditions, I think it's awareness is very important. Oftentimes in various contexts, when Christianity is spoken of, it's always considered to be a Western-born or Western-grown religion and things of that nature. But it's important for the West to realize that Christianity is an Eastern religion. Christianity was born in the East. The apostles preached in the East. Christ lived, died, and rose again in the East. So Christianity began in the East. And that's where I think also our local brothers and sisters, the various Christian churches, not only in Iraq, but other parts of the Middle East region, also play a very important role in preserving Christianity in the Middle East. That is a challenge we face on various levels in the Middle East, but that awareness by our Western brethren is very, very important. And that will help us also to be faithful to who we are as Christians, albeit we're a global church, but our roots are in the East. Our identity comes from the East. So in order for us to be faithful to that and to carry on that torch, if you will, we need the awareness and the support of our Western brothers and sisters.
Your Holiness, thank you so much for this opportunity, and
Well,
we really appreciate your time and commitment to making this happen.
Thank you. It was my
Thank you
joy.
so much, Your Holiness.